Story 1. This story was sent by a viewer, and it happened some time ago. I was in the middle of a dull routine. Day after day, the lockdown stretched on like a never-ending blur, the four walls of my apartment becoming my only company. I had always been a solitary person, but the isolation that came with quarantine was starting to gnaw at me. The quiet, oppressive silence was unbroken, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the low hum of the refrigerator. Even the distant city noise, usually a constant in the background, had vanished. My apartment, like many in the building, was old, one of those creaky buildings with history you could feel under your feet. The hallway smelled faintly of mothballs, and the walls had the pale yellow tint of years of neglect. It wasn't much, but it had always been home. The rent was cheap, and the landlord, a quiet man who rarely made appearances, seemed content to let things slide. But that all changed when I discovered the door. I had been cleaning the hallway, a task I had put off for weeks. The dusty old vacuum in my closet had sat untouched, and the floors were covered in a layer of grime that seemed to cling to everything. As I worked my way toward the end of the hallway, a door I had never noticed before caught my attention. I had walked this hall hundreds of times, but this door, it was different. The wood was dark and smooth, and the handle seemed too new, too polished compared to the rest of the apartment's fixtures. Curious, I approached it slowly, a shiver running down my spine. The hallway was unnaturally silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I tried the door handle, expecting to be locked, but to my surprise, it turned with ease. The door creaked open with a sound that echoed too loudly for such a small space, and I felt an immediate cold draft rush out from behind it. I hesitated. My first instinct was to close the door and pretend I had never seen it, but something about it compelled me to step forward. It felt like a challenge, something daring me to enter. Stepping to the threshold, I found myself in an unfamiliar room, bathed in a faint, yellowish light that seemed to come from nowhere. The air was stale, almost suffocating, and thick with the scent of old wood and dust. Everything in the room was perfectly still, untouched by time, as if it had been locked away for years. The room was small, not much bigger than a storage closet. It was filled with old furniture, an antique armchair covered in a thick layer of dust, a cracked wooden table, and a faded rug that looked as though it hadn't been walked on in decades. The walls were lined with faded portraits of people I didn't recognize, their eyes seeming to follow me as I moved across the room. I felt an uneasy pull in the pit of my stomach, but I pushed it aside, chalking it up to the isolation getting to me. I walked deeper into the room, my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The room seemed to breathe, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the air around me. I ran my fingers along the edge of the table, picking up a fine layer of dust, and noticed something odd. There were symbols carved into the wood. They were faint, almost like scratches, but intricate in their design. They seemed to form some sort of pattern, but it was difficult to make out, like something deliberately hidden. I leaned in closer, my curiosity getting the better of me. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. I froze, straining my ears, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. I stood there for a moment, waiting for any sign that I wasn't alone in the room, but nothing stirred, just the silence. I stepped away from the table, my eyes scanning the rest of the room. There was an old bookshelf stacked with leather-bound books, their spines worn with age. One book in particular caught my eye. It was on the very top shelf, wedged between two other books, as if it had been placed there deliberately. Without thinking, I reached up to pull it down, my fingers brushing against the rough surface of the spine. The moment the book was in my hands, I felt a strange, almost electric jolt pass through me. I opened the book cautiously, its pages brittle and yellow with age. The writing was in a language I didn't recognize, but the pages were filled with illustrations, sketches of symbols similar to ones on the table, and strange, eerie figures that seemed to move when I looked at them from the corner of my eye. I turned the pages slowly, absorbing the eerie artwork, but the further I went, the more unsettled I became. There was something almost alive about the pages. It was as if they were calling me. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling my ears with a language I couldn't understand. That's when I saw it. At the very back of the book, There was a photograph, faded and yellowed with age. The picture depicted a young man, standing in front of what looked like this very room. His expression was one of pure terror, his eyes wide and unblinking, as if it just witnessed something he couldn't comprehend. I stared at the photograph for a moment, a chill running down my spine. The man in the photo, he looked familiar, but I couldn't place him. I turned the book over, looking for any indication of who he was. But there was nothing, just a name scribbled at the bottom, in a hand that seemed to tremble, Elliot Ward. The name meant nothing to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I knew him, that somehow he had been a part of my life. It was then that I felt it. The room had changed. The air felt heavier, as if something had shifted. A cold, unnatural wind swept through the room, causing the pages of the book to flutter wildly. I closed the book with a snap, feeling my pulse race. I stepped back toward the door, wanting to leave, to get out of this strange, suffocating place. But as I reached for the handle, a voice, clear and sharp, whispered directly into my ear, "Leave now or stay forever." I froze, heart pounding, the room spinning around me. I turned to look over my shoulder, but no one was there. The door was still open, but the hallway beyond it seemed distant and unreachable, as though it was fading into the darkness. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined the voice. But deep down, I knew better. There was something in this room, something ancient, waiting. I stepped out, shutting the door behind me. But a feeling of being watched never left. And the whisper followed me, lingering in the back of my mind. I had to know what this room was, and I had to know who Elliot Ward was. But I was about to find out that the answers I sought would come at a cost, one that I would regret seeking. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The door behind me felt heavier than ever, as if it had become part of the building itself, locking me in with whatever secrets lay hidden in that room. For the next few days, I tried to ignore the pull of the forgotten room. I tried to go about my daily routine, to convince myself that my imagination had run wild. But the whispers, the voices I had heard in that room, stuck with me. It was like the building itself was alive, watching me. Every creak of the floor, every sigh of the walls felt like a warning. The apartment felt colder, more oppressive, as though the room was somehow reaching out to me even when I wasn't near it. And every time I closed my eyes, I could hear that voice again, the one that had whispered into my ear, warning me to leave. Leave now or stay forever. I tried to distract myself. I binge-watched shows I'd already seen a dozen times, tried reading books, but the words blurred on the page. My mind wouldn't stop going back to the room, to the book, to the photograph, and most of all, to the name I had found, Elliot Ward. I couldn't get him out of my head. Why did I feel like I knew him? Why did his terrified face feel so familiar? Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back. I waited until the dead of night. The apartment was silent, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rattle of the wind against the windows. I grabbed the book from my shelf, my fingers trembling as I turned it over my hands. The photograph I had seen earlier was still burned into my memory. Elliot's wide eyes, his pale face, the sense of panic frozen in time. I walked down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. Each step fell heavier, each footfall echoing in the silence. The door at the end of the hall loomed ahead like a dark mouth ready to swallow me whole. When I reached it, my hand paused on the doorknob, hesitant. But I turned anyway. The door creaked open with the same eerie sound as before, and the chill from within rushed out to meet me. The room was just as I had left it, dusty, cold, and lifeless. But this time it felt different. The air felt thicker, charged with an energy I couldn't quite explain. My skin prickled, my breath shallow as I stepped inside. I moved toward the table again, my eyes immediately drawn to the markings I had seen before. They hadn't changed, still faint, still mysterious. I leaned in close, my fingers hovering over them, almost as if they were calling to me. The same sense of dread gnawed at my insides, but I couldn't look away. There was something about these symbols that demanded attention, something that made my pulse quicken with a strange mix of fear and curiosity. Suddenly, the whispers returned, soft at first, like a breeze rustling through the leaves of a tree. But they grew louder, more distinct, until they filled the room, swirling around me. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was as if the voices were beckoning me to understand something I was desperately trying to avoid. I turned around, my heart racing in my chest. I could feel a presence behind me, though the room was empty. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, flickering like they were alive. I took a step back, my mind screaming at me to leave. But something inside me, something darker, refused to let me. I had to know what this was. I glanced back at the bookshelf, my eyes catching on the same book I had held earlier, the one with the symbols and the photograph. I wasn't sure why, but I felt drawn to it again. I reached up to pull it down, but just as my fingers brushed the spine, I heard something else, something louder than the whispers, a soft, almost imperceptible scratching noise coming from the walls. My breath caught in my throat. I froze listening. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the building settling. The sound was deliberate, like something or someone was trying to get out. I turned, looking around the room, but the shadows seemed to grow deeper, darker. The scratching noise continued, echoing off the walls, almost in rhythm with my heartbeat. My pulse quickened. I reached for the door, my hand shaking as I grabbed the handle. But the door wouldn't budge. It was stuck. I pulled harder, panic rising in my chest, but the door wouldn't move. I looked back at the room, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The scratching had stopped, but now there was a new sound. A faint thumping, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. It came from behind the bookshelf. I approached cautiously, my feet barely making a sound on the floor. The thumping grew louder, and the air around me grew colder. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck, standing up, my hands clammy. I slowly moved the bookshelf aside, revealing a small, hidden door built into the wall behind it. My heart skipped a beat. The door was small, old, and barely noticeable. The same symbols I had seen earlier were etched into the frame. I stared at it, my mind racing. What was behind that door? What had been hidden away for so long? I reached for the doorknob, my fingers trembling. It turned easily, as if it had been waiting for me all this time. The door opened slowly with a creak, revealing a small, dark room beyond. The air inside was thick with dust and age, but something else was there too, a presence that made my stomach churn. I stepped inside. At first, I couldn't make out much in the darkness, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw them. Old photographs, similar to the one in the book, lined the walls. Faces I didn't recognize, but whose expressions mirrored the terror I had seen in Elliot Ward's face. The same wide eyes, the same silent scream. And in the center of the room, a single chair sat facing the wall. My breath caught in my throat as I saw what was strapped to it. A man, his body twisted in an unnatural position, his face frozen in a look of sheer horror. It was Elliot Ward. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The room felt like it was closing in on me. But then I heard the whisper again. "You're next." I turned, but the door slammed shut behind me. The shadows in the room shifted, and I was no longer alone. The door slammed shut behind me with a force that made the walls tremble. The room seemed to close in on me, the air thick with the oppressive scent of decay and fear. My breath was shallow, each inhale a struggle as I turned frantically, searching for an escape. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow, stretching toward me with an insidious intent, like fingers reaching out to claim me. I felt the coldness at my back as the door locked, its creaking hinge the only sound in the suffocating silence. Panic clawed at my chest. I was trapped. The photographs on the walls, those faces, those terrified expressions, watched me, their eyes boring into my soul. They were frozen in time, but I could feel them moving, sensing me, judging me. Elliot Ward's face loomed above the others, his wide eyes fixed on me, as if he had known this moment would come. I stumbled backward, my mind scrambling for any rational explanation. Maybe this was just a nightmare. Maybe I was hallucinating. I reached for the door, banging on it with my fists, but it wouldn't budge. The heavy thumping sound from before returned, but this time it was accompanied by something worse, soft, labored breathing, coming from somewhere behind me. I whipped around, my heart racing. The chair at the center of the room was now empty. The man, Elliot Ward, was gone, but the chair had not moved. It was still in the center of the room, as if it had never been disturbed. My pulse pounded in my ears, and my legs felt like jelly as I backed away. A voice, soft but unmistakable, whispered to the air like a cold wind. "You shouldn't have come." The voice echoed from all sides, wrapping around me like a noose. It was Elliot's voice, but there was something wrong with it, something twisted. It was as if his very essence had been distorted by the room. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Every corner seemed to reverberate with his words. The whispering grew louder, rising in intensity until it became a cacophony, drowning out all rational thought. I pressed my hands to my ears, desperate to block it out, but it only grew more insistent. And then, as if the room itself were responding to my panic, the shadows in the corners began to move. They swirled and twisted like living things, shifting and stretching toward me. I stumbled backward, my hands frantically searching for anything to hold on to. I reached out and grabbed the first object I could find, the dusty old book from the table, the one that had started all of this. The pages had become brittle, yellow with age, but it still felt solid in my hands. I opened it again, flipping to the pages, desperate to find some clue, something that would explain what was happening. And then I found it. At the back of the book, hidden among the strange symbols and illustrations, there was a single last entry. The handwriting was different this time, slanted, jagged, almost frantic. I could barely make out the words, but the meaning was clear. "They are coming for you. The room keeps you. The room decides. You are its next victim." Elliot Ward was never meant to leave. My heart stopped. I could feel the coldness creeping up my spine, my skin crawling. It was like the very air in the room was alive, alive with the memories of the people who had come before me, the ones who had sat in that chair, the ones who had disappeared without a trace. I heard the breathing again, closer this time, almost at my ear. I spun around, but there was no one there, only the shadows, now writhing and twisting, taking on grotesque shapes. I could hear footsteps, soft and deliberate, moving toward me. The air grew colder, impossibly so. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I could feel the chill sinking into my bones. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the wall. It formed into a figure, tall, thin, its face hidden in the darkness. I couldn't see its features, but I could feel its presence, its gaze fixed on me. "You should have left when you had the chance." The voice rasped, a hoarse whisper that sent a wave of terror through me. I tried to scream, but the words caught in my throat. My legs refused to move. I was frozen, trapped in the nightmare I had unknowingly stepped into. The figure stepped forward, and with it, the room seemed to expand. The shadows grew longer, more oppressive, and I realized the walls weren't just closing in. They were bending. The room itself was alive, shifting, transforming. The air thickened, becoming suffocating, pressing against me from all sides. I took a step backward, my mind racing. I had to get out. I had to escape. But the figure moved again, blocking my path. There was nowhere to go. Elliot never left. The voice echoed again, this time sounding less like a whisper and more like a scream, reverberating through the room. "And neither will you." The figure stepped into the dim light, and I saw it. A face, but not a face. It was distorted, hollow, like a person who had been trapped for so long that they had forgotten what it meant to be human. The eyes were wide, empty sockets that burned with an unnatural light. It was Elliot Ward, but it wasn't him anymore. It was something else, something that had taken over his body, his mind, his very soul. I could feel the darkness closing in. The room was no longer just a space. It was a prison. It was alive, feeding off my fear, feeding off the despair of everyone who had ever stepped inside. It had claimed them, and now it was claiming me. I reached for the door again, my fingers desperate, but it wouldn't open. The walls around me pulsed with a sickening rhythm, like the heartbeat of some ancient, malevolent creature. The darkness pressing from all sides, and I knew I was never going to leave. I turned to face the figure one last time, and Elliot's twisted face grinned. The last thing I heard before the world collapsed around me was his voice, now a guttural, mocking whisper. "Welcome to your new home." And then everything went dark. The room stood empty, the door locked once more, waiting for its next victim. Story 2. This story was sent by a viewer, and it happened some time ago. The sound of my suitcase wheels echoed through the silent hallway as I walked into the apartment complex for the first time. It was an old building, one of those places that felt frozen in time, with peeling wallpaper and a musty scent that lingered in the air. The floors creaked under my feet, and the dim lighting did little to mask the neglected corners where dust had settled. But it was cheap, and at the start of a pandemic. That was all I cared about. I had just moved to the city, escaping a chaotic few months and hoping to find some peace. The lockdown was in full swing, and the world felt as though it had come to a standstill. There weren't many people around, which suited me fine. I liked solitude. It gave me time to think, to settle into a new place without distractions. My apartment was small, barely enough room for a bed, a desk, and a few boxes of things I hadn't even unpacked yet. But it was mine, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. But that calm didn't last long. It was the third night when I first heard the noise. I had just finished watching a documentary about the most haunted places in the world, mostly for background noise, nothing serious. As I turned off the TV, preparing to go to bed, a soft whisper reached my ears. At first, I thought it was just the creaking of the building, the sound of an old structure settling. But no, it was distinct, like someone talking quietly in the apartment next door. I stood still for a moment, listening. The whispers grew louder, like someone was murmuring in a language I didn't recognize. The walls were thin in the complex, so it wasn't unusual to hear the neighbors on occasion. But this felt different. The voices didn't sound like a conversation. They sounded more like a chant, an incantation of some kind. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, maybe even my imagination running wild after spending the day inside. But the whispering continued. And it wasn't just in the hallway. It was coming from the apartment next door, the one whose door I had passed countless times but never thought to pay attention to. A door I had never even seen anyone go in or out of. Curiosity got the better of me. I walked out into the hallway, my bare feet making little noise on the old wood floors. The apartment across from mine was quiet, its door slightly ajar. The light from inside flickered faintly through the cracks. I stood there hesitant before deciding to knock. A moment passed, and I knocked again, a little louder this time. No response. I leaned closer to the door, my ear pressed against the cold wood. The whispers had stopped, but something else caught my attention, a faint scratching sound, like something being dragged across the floor inside. I pulled away, startled. My heart began to race as I glanced around the hallway. There was nobody else around, no one to witness the oddity of it. I walked back to my apartment, tried to shake the unease that had settled in my stomach, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, I went about my business as usual, more unpacking, organizing my space. But when night came, the whispers returned. I wasn't imagining it this time. The voices were louder, clearer, and unmistakably closer. It was as if they were inside my apartment. I grabbed my phone and texted my friend Karen. "Hey, do you know anything about the neighbors next door? I swear I keep hearing weird noises coming from there, and it's creeping me out." Her reply came almost instantly. "Not sure, but I think they've been there a while. They never really leave. I've heard some strange things about that apartment, though. You should be careful." That was enough to send a chill through me. Strange things. I texted back, but Karen didn't respond right away. I spent the rest of the evening in silence, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. The whispers died down after a while, and I managed to fall asleep. But when I woke up the next morning, something was different. The apartment felt colder, as though the very air had changed. I tried to shake it off as a product of an old building with faulty heating, but it lingered. The following week passed in a blur of solitude. The world outside seemed to shrink even more as the lockdown continued, and the apartment complex felt emptier by the day. Yet, the whispers never stopped. They came and went in waves, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but always persistent. I began to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. I decided to investigate. That evening, I waited for the noise to start again. When it did, I grabbed my phone and opened a camera, aiming it toward the door of the apartment next door. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but I had to know. The whispers seemed to intensify as the camera focused on the door. Then, through the lens, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure, barely visible in the shadows, moving around inside the apartment. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its face, I couldn't make it out, but its movements were unnaturally jerky, like it wasn't quite human. My heart pounded as the camera captured the figure pacing back and forth in front of the door. I quickly turned off my phone and backed away, my pulse racing. My mind was spinning. What was going on? Who was in there? The next morning, I finally saw someone outside the door, the first person I had seen in days. A man, dressed in dark clothes, was standing just outside. He glanced up at me as I walked by, his eyes locking with mine for a brief moment. His gaze was cold, empty. He didn't speak, but something about his stare sent a jolt of fear through me. I quickly averted my eyes and hurried back to my apartment. But something wasn't right. Something about that brief interaction didn't sit well with me. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore the increasing unease, but I couldn't. The whispers grew louder, and each time I glanced toward the neighbor's door, I felt a presence on the other side. I had no more. I couldn't ignore it any longer. So, that evening, I made up my mind. I was going to knock on that door again. This time, I wasn't leaving until I got answers. Little did I know, that knock would set off a chain of events that would uncover a dark secret. A secret that would change everything I thought I knew about the apartment, my neighbors, and the terrifying truth lurking just behind that door. The hallway felt colder than usual when I stepped out of my apartment the next evening. The soft hum of the old building's lights seemed dimmer, more distant. I could hear the faint whispers again, but this time they were different. They weren't just disembodied voices. They were urgent, like someone trying to get my attention. I walked slowly toward the door of the apartment next to mine, my heart pounding in my chest. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. As I neared the door, the whispers grew louder, clearer, as if someone were on the other side, just out of reach, yet undeniably present. I took a deep breath and knocked once, twice, my knuckles hitting the wood with an unsettling echo. Silence followed. My eyes drifted toward the doorframe. With the faintest trace of crack allowed a sliver of light to seep through from the other side. No response. I stood there for a moment, unsure whether I should leave or knock again. My instincts told me to walk away, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I knocked again, more urgently this time. The door creaked open just slightly, a thin sliver wide enough to let me catch a glimpse of what was inside. A pale, gaunt face appeared, framed by the darkness beyond. The eyes were hollow, deep-set and cold. I couldn't make out much of the person's features, but the air around them was thick with an unnatural stillness. "Yes?" the figure asked in a voice that was too soft, too hollow. I was wondering if everything was okay in there. I stammered, my own voice shaky. "I've been hearing some strange noises, and The figure didn't respond immediately. They just stared at me for what felt like an eternity. Finally, they blinked, their gaze sharp and unsettling. "We're fine," the person said, their voice like a whisper wrapped in velvet. "Just staying in for the night. Everything's fine." It was the way they said it, though. That set me on edge. There was something wrong with their tone, as if they were reciting a line they had rehearsed. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice growing bolder despite the creeping unease in my stomach. "I've been hearing voices and scratching sounds. I'm not sure what's going on." The figure's lips twitched, a brief flicker of something unsettling crossing their face before they composed themselves again. "Nothing for you to worry about," they said, their gaze drifting toward the floor, as though they were suddenly trying to avoid eye contact. "You should go inside. Stay safe." Before I could say anything else, the door began to close. But just before it shut completely, I saw it. The unmistakable outline of a symbol scratched into the wood. It wasn't a simple mark. It was intricate, deliberate, and it looked like something I had seen in the book I found earlier. The same symbols I had ignored, thinking they were just bizarre doodles. My pulse quickened. I hadn't imagined it. There was something here, something I wasn't being told. Without thinking, I pushed the door slightly open and stepped inside, ignoring the protests that echoed from the other side. The room was dimly lit, but I could make out a few details. The walls were lined with old furniture, antique-looking pieces, dusty and abandoned. It smelled musty, the air heavy with the scent of mildew. But it wasn't the clutter that made me freeze in place. It was a strange, eerie energy that filled the space. It felt wrong. I looked around the room, my heart pounding in my chest. There were odd symbols painted on the walls, symbols like the ones I had seen etched into the door. They weren't just decorations. They were part of the room itself, embedded in the very structure, as if they had always been there. And in the center of the room stood a large wooden altar, draped in cloth that looked old enough to have been buried with history. "What is this?" I whispered to myself, as my hand instinctively reached for the door to leave. But then I saw it. On the far side of the room, partially obscured by a curtain, a figure stood motionless, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. It was a woman, pale with hollow eyes, her skin almost translucent in the dim light. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her presence felt like a weight pressing down on me. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The woman's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She tilted her head, studying me as though I was some kind of specimen under a microscope. "We've been waiting for you," she said softly, her voice like the rustle of leaves on a quiet night. The words sent a chill down my spine. "Waiting for me?" I echoed, stepping back. "For what?" The woman didn't answer immediately. She took a step forward, her bare feet barely making a sound on the cold wooden floor. Her gaze locked onto mine, and for the first time, I felt something more than fear. I felt entrapment. "You've heard the whispers," she said, her voice lowering to a near whisper. "You've heard the scratching. The room calls you. The building calls you." The realization hit me like a slap in the face. I wasn't just hearing things. It wasn't just an old building with creaky floors. It was something far worse. This place, this room, was alive, and it had been waiting for me. As my thoughts raced, I heard a faint noise from the back of the apartment, a low, rhythmic thumping, like something or someone moving inside the walls. "You're not alone," the woman continued, her voice distant now, almost like an echo. "None of us are, and soon neither will you be." Before I could process the words, the room seemed to shift. The shadows grew darker, and the whispers returned, louder, more insistent. They filled my ears, pushing me closer to the woman, to the altar. I turned, trying to make my way toward the door, but the floor beneath me fell unsteady. The air thickened, pressing it on me from all sides. The woman's words were no longer whispers. They had become commands. "Stay," she said softly, her voice carrying a strange power. "Stay with us. You belong here." The floor creaked, and I glanced down. A strange, thick substance had begun to seep from the cracks in the floorboards, spreading like ink. It was too late. I knew it was too late. I stumbled backward, my hands outstretched toward the door. But the room had become a maze, its walls bending inward, shifting, closing in on me. The woman's smile widened as I realized the truth. The building, the cult, the whispers, it was all connected. They had been waiting for someone to take the place of the next sacrifice. And now it was me. I tried to run, but the room shifted in a way that made it feel like the walls themselves were closing in, narrowing the space between me and the door. My breaths grew shallow, panicked. Every time I turned toward the exit, it seemed farther away. The whispers intensified, now no longer distant murmurs, but sharp, jagged voices, overlapping in an incomprehensible chant. I reached out, grasping for the door handle, but the room seemed to breathe with me, as if it were alive. The air thickened, pushing against my chest, squeezing the breath out of me. The shadows in the corners of the room twisted and turned like living things, stretching, pulling toward me, reaching for my skin. They didn't move like shadows. They wanted something. Something I couldn't yet understand. I pulled harder at the door, my heart hammering in my chest. But it wouldn't budge. I pounded on the wood with my fists, the sound echoing in the suffocating silence. Panic surged in my veins, and the floor beneath me groaned, shifting as though it were a living organism. "Help me?" I screamed, but the words caught in my throat. There was no one coming. The building was empty. There was no escape. The woman's voice was calm, too calm for the chaos that had consumed the room. "You're not leaving," she whispered, stepping closer to me. "No one ever leaves. The room has chosen you." I turned to face her, my body trembling. Her pale face seemed to glow in the dim light, her eyes wide and dark, pools of endless nothing. She smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was a kind of smile that signified an awful truth, one I wasn't ready to hear. "You've been marked," she said, her voice lilting as if she were explaining something simple, like the weather. "All of us, we've been waiting. You've felt it, haven't you? The whispers, the scratching. It was never just noise. It was inviting you, pulling you here." I stumbled back, my hands pressing against the walls, as though I could push the very structure of the building away. The symbols, the marks, everything started to make sense in a way I wasn't prepared for. This wasn't a regular apartment complex. This wasn't even a regular building. It was a place for something ancient, something wrong. You mean, I gasped for breath. "This room is cursed?" She nodded slowly, the movement too deliberate, too unnatural. "Not just the room, the building, the ground it sits on. It has always been here, waiting, and now so are you." Her smile stretched wider, her lips parting to reveal teeth too sharp, too pointed. The whispers rose, louder now, overlapping in a mad frenzy of voices. "You belong to us," they chanted. "You belong to us." I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping for it to stop, but it didn't. The air was thick with their voices, with the weight of their intent. My chest tightened. It felt like the walls were pressing in on me, squeezing the life from my lungs, and yet the woman in front of me stood untouched by the madness. She was alive in this nightmare, part of it, and somehow I realized with jolt of horror I was becoming part of it too. "Why me?" I managed to whisper, feeling the edges of my sanity slipping away. "Why me of all people?" She tilted her head, her hollow eyes studying me with something that might have been pity. "Because you were meant to be here, just like all the others before you." The floor beneath me creaked, and suddenly I wasn't standing alone. The shadows I'd seen earlier swarmed forward, stretching out to wrap around my legs, my arms. They were like tendrils, cool and insistent, pulling me toward the center of the room. I tried to fight them, tried to scream, but no sound escaped my mouth. My body moved on its own, dragged by something far stronger than me. The altar stood in the center of the room now, looming over me like an executioner's block. The woman's voice was soft, soothing almost, like a lullaby. "You'll join us, just like everyone before you. The room will make you like us." I struggled, panic coursing through me. "I'm not like you." I screamed inside my mind, but my body didn't listen. It moved forward, closer to the altar, as if my will had no power here. "Let go," the woman whispered. "It's already too late." I stopped in front of the altar, and something shifted inside me. A coldness washed over me, a sharp, icy sensation that made my skin feel like it was crawling. My fingers, now completely under control of whatever force held me, reached out to touch the cloth that covered the altar. The moment my fingers brushed against the fabric, a wave of energy surged through me, burning, pulling, like I was being tethered to something much darker. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow, pulsing in time with the rhythm of the whispers. The shadows in the room writhed, moving in an intricate dance around me, as if the building itself were breathing. The air tasted thick, metallic, like blood. The woman stood behind me, her voice almost a lullaby, whispering in my ear. "This is what we are. This is what the room has made us. And this is what it will make you." I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, choked with fear and the oppressive weight of the room. I couldn't pull away, couldn't move. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They were alive, and they were inside me now. A chill spread through my limbs, and my body felt like it was being drained, emptied of everything I had once been. The woman's voice continued. You will stay here, just as the others have, trapped in the room forever. And when the next one comes, the cycle will begin again. I turned toward her, my mouth opening to speak, to beg for mercy, but no words came out. Instead, I saw it. The room was no longer just a room. It was alive. The walls were covered in faces now. Twisted, contorted faces of people who had been trapped here, just like me. They were screaming without sound, their mouths open wide. But all I heard was the eerie chant that filled my head. You are one of us now, the woman said, her voice growing distant, fading into the rising storm of sound. And when you are ready, you will call the next one. You will be the one waiting. And then the world went dark. The room was empty again, save for the shadows, always watching. Story 3. This story was sent by a viewer, and it happened some time ago. The world outside my window was silent. The usual bustle of the city now reduced to a distant hum behind the closed blinds. I hadn't expected this lockdown to drag on for so long. At first, I'd welcome the quiet, the solitude, the chance to stay in and relax without the noise of the world. But now, days had bled into weeks, and I was starting to feel it, this creeping, gnawing sense of something off-kilter. I'd always been a solitary person, comfortable in my own space. The apartment I rented was small, just enough for me to live comfortably, with a view of the skyline on good days. But as time passed, it started to feel less like a home and more like a cell. The world outside had stopped, but inside, I could feel my mind moving faster, and then slowly, steadily spiraling. At first, it wasn't anything significant, just a mild headache that came and went. Then a slight cough, nothing alarming. Maybe just a reaction to the change in weather, the dry air of winter settling in. But when I woke up one morning drenched in sweat, feverish, with a pounding headache and dizziness that had me stumbling to the bathroom, I knew something wasn't right. I hadn't left the apartment in days, except to grab groceries from the corner store down the block. But this wasn't just a cold. This was something else. For the first 2 days, I told myself it was a flu, something common. I stocked up on cold medicine and tea, trying to push through. But as the days passed, I grew weaker. Every step felt like dragging my body through thick mud. It wasn't just the illness. There was something else, a strange pressure, an unease that seemed to hang in the air, thickening with each hour. I spent most of my time in bed, unable to focus on anything. The television remained off. The books I'd been reading lay untouched on the nightstand. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts clouded, my body aching. It wasn't a fever anymore. It was this feeling that I couldn't shake, a heaviness pressing in from all sides. And it wasn't just in my body. It was in the apartment. The strange noises started on the second night. It began as a soft scratching sound, faint but distinct. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, the pipes groaning as they always did. But the sound came again, louder this time, and then another one, closer. It seemed to be coming from the walls, from somewhere just beyond my reach. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my fever-induced delirium. But as the night dragged on, I could feel the unease settle deeper into my bones. I pulled the covers up tighter, trying to block out the noise, but it only got worse. I should have gotten up, should have checked, but something inside me told me to stay still, to keep my eyes closed. And that's when I heard it, clearer this time, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like someone was speaking directly into my ear. Daniel. I froze. I blinked rapidly, trying to shake off the fogginess in my mind. My own name, but I couldn't remember the last time anyone had said it aloud. There was no one here. Daniel. The voice came again, slower this time, dragging the syllables. My name sounded like a warning. I sat up quickly, heart pounding, the room spinning around me as dizziness took over. I gripped the edge of the bed, trying to steady myself. But the sound, that whisper, wouldn't leave my mind. I should have called someone. I should have reached out. But no one was near. Everyone was isolating. Everyone was stuck in their own little bubbles. I was alone, as I always had been. I tried to ignore the growing sensation. The voices echoing in the back of my mind. The fever raged on, and I could feel my temperature rising, my body slick with sweat, but I forced myself to rise from the bed. I stumbled into the bathroom, my reflection in the mirror a shadow of myself. The fever had reddened my cheeks, but it wasn't just the illness. There was something more, something strange, something I couldn't quite explain. The apartment felt different, like it was watching me. I walked back into the living room, my steps faltering, the ground beneath my feet uneven. I sat down on the couch, trying to shake off the fog in my head. That's when I noticed it. Another sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was faint, like someone was knocking from somewhere in the walls. The sound was almost soothing, but that was the problem. It shouldn't have been. It was a sound I couldn't place. I got up, my legs unsteady beneath me. My feet carried me toward the sound without my consent. The hallway outside my apartment was dark, the shadows in the corners stretching as though they were alive. I didn't want to check. I didn't want to open that door. But I had to. Something was driving me, pulling me forward. I stood before it, the apartment door wide open, and I knocked. Softly at first, my knuckles tapping against the wood. No answer. Then louder, more insistent, until the wood felt cold against my hand. There was a pause before the door creaked open slightly, just enough to reveal an inch of darkness. I didn't see anyone, not at first. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw it. Movement, shadows shifting in the corner. No one stepped into view. I could feel the cold air from inside the apartment sweeping toward me. But there was no one standing in the doorway. The silence was suffocating. "Hello?" I called, my voice too weak to carry far. No response. I stepped back, unsure what I had just seen or hadn't seen. The shadows lingered there in the doorway, like a secret being kept from me. But then something tugged at me. A voice. "Daniel." It whispered again, clearer now. "Come inside." I stepped back, my heart racing, and shut the door before I could think better of it. My breath was shallow as I staggered back into my apartment, the unease gnawing at me. But as I sat down again, something inside me told me that it wasn't over. That whatever had been in the walls, whatever was calling my name, was just getting started, and I would never be alone again. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The whispering, the scratching, the cold draft that seemed to move through the cracks in the apartment. It was like the apartment itself was alive. Every night, it felt like I was sharing the space with something, or someone who wasn't supposed to be there. I had no explanation for it, no rational reason why I could hear things that weren't there. But I knew what I felt. The fever had only worsened. I wasn't eating properly, and every time I tried to get out of bed, dizziness would sweep over me like a tidal wave. The noises in the apartment continued, but now I couldn't ignore them. It wasn't just the walls creaking or the wind howling outside. This was something different. It was deliberate, like a presence trying to make itself known. The whispers had become clearer, and now they seemed to follow me. The same voice, low and guttural, calling my name. "Daniel." It whispered at all hours of the day, its tone too familiar, as though it were a friend or an old acquaintance beckoning me. But it wasn't a voice I recognized. That night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was causing the strange sounds. I had to know if I was losing my mind, or if there was something truly wrong with this apartment. I grabbed my phone, the dim screen lighting up the otherwise dark space, and texted my best friend, Karen. "Hey, have you noticed anything weird about your apartment? Scratching sounds or whispers at night?" I felt ridiculous sending the message, but I had to reach out. I needed someone to tell me I wasn't imagining this. She didn't reply immediately. I sat back in bed, watching the screen as the seconds stretched on. The silence in the apartment seemed to deepen. Then a reply buzzed in my phone. "You mean at 3 a.m., when I heard someone whisper my name from the hallway? I thought I was losing it. Are you okay?" Her words made my stomach tighten. I wasn't the only one hearing things. What do you think it is? I texted back, trying to keep my voice steady, but my fingers trembled as I typed. Her response came quickly. Maybe an old building? Or maybe you're just sick. You should see a doctor. Dan, this isn't normal. I stared at her message for a long time. Was it just my illness messing with me, making me hear things that weren't there? Was this just a side effect of the fever? My hands were shaking now, not from the cold, but from fear. I thought about what Karen said. I had to get up. I had to move to make sense of all this. I threw off the covers and wobbled out of bed, leaning heavily on the wall as my legs buckled under me. The dizziness was relentless. I walked cautiously toward the living room, my mind still reeling from the thought of the voice calling my name. I reached the doorway and stood there for a moment, listening. There was again, soft, faint, like the sound of wind through a crack. I looked around the room, half expecting something or someone to be standing there in the shadows, but it was empty. The apartment was still. The curtains hung motionless, not even the slightest breath of air stirring them. I felt the weight of the silence press down on me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Then I heard it again, closer this time. The soft scratching noise, like nails dragging against the wood. My heart began to race, and I walked toward the source of the sound, my eyes scanning every inch of the room. It was coming from the walls, faint and insistent. I froze. The noise was unmistakable, too clear to ignore. It wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't the wind or the pipes. It was something inside the walls. The very walls of the apartment seemed to be alive with the sound, and it made me feel as though I was intruding in a place that wasn't meant for me. I pressed my ear against the wall, hoping for an explanation. Maybe it was an old pipe, something clogged. Maybe it was just the building settling under the pressure of age. But as I stood there, trying to convince myself, I felt it, another whisper. This one was clear, sharper than the others. Daniel. I jumped back, my pulse racing. It came from the wall. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. My mind scrambled for answers, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. There had to be a rational explanation. But at that moment, I knew I wasn't alone in this apartment. I stepped back and grabbed my phone again. I called Karen, my fingers fumbling to unlock the screen. She answered on the second ring. Hello. Her voice sounded distant, as though she were distracted. Karen, it's happening again. I'm hearing it. Whispers. They're coming from the walls. My voice was tight, barely a whisper. I felt ridiculous, but I had no idea how to explain it. It's not just a fever. Something's wrong. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then Karen's voice softened. Dan, what do you mean? Is someone in your apartment? I don't know, I whispered. It sounds like someone's calling my name. And the walls, they're scratching. It's like there's something behind them. I'm not making this up, Karen. It feels real. Okay, she said, her voice calm now, but I could hear the concern beneath it. Listen, I want you to stay calm. I'm coming over. I'm not letting you stay in there by yourself. No. I protested quickly, but my voice betrayed me, wavering. It's fine. I'll just stay in the room. I'm fine. You're not fine, Dan. Please, just wait for me. I'll be there in an hour. I hung up, a sense of dread settling over me. I didn't want to wait. I didn't want to sit there any longer, listening to the scratching, feeling the cold breath of whatever was moving in the apartment. But Karen was right. I wasn't okay, and I couldn't face whatever this was alone. I sat back down on the couch, trying to distract myself, to make sense of what was happening. But the apartment felt wrong. The walls felt alive, pressing in on me. I could almost hear the apartment breathing, and all I could do was sit there, helpless, waiting for Karen to arrive. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment, hoping that the darkness would drown out the whispers. But when I opened them again, I was no longer alone. I felt the presence before I saw it, a shadow standing in the doorway. Daniel. It whispered, again, softer now, like a promise. My heart stopped. The figure stepped forward, and I realized with growing horror that the shape was too familiar. It was me. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the figure in the doorway. I knew it was me, but it wasn't me, not entirely. The figure before me was hollow, like a reflection in a cracked mirror, distorted and wrong. It stood motionless, an unnatural stillness in the air, as if it didn't quite belong in the space it occupied. The same height, the same face, but the eyes were wrong. "Daniel," the figure whispered again, its voice a cold echo of my own. It sounded like a question, but it also held something else, something dark, an invitation, a beckoning. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as dust. I tried to move, to speak, but the air around me thickened, making it feel like the room was closing in, suffocating me. I could hear my own pulse, loud in my ears. My hands, clammy with sweat, trembled at my sides. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, cracking with fear. I didn't expect an answer. I knew, in some part of my mind, that it wasn't a real person, not in the way I understood. It was something else, something that had been waiting. The figure didn't respond right away. It stepped forward, its movements too slow, too deliberate. As it moved, it seemed to draw the darkness with it. Shadows curling around its feet, stretching and distorting like the very air was bending under its weight. "You know who I am," it said, its voice slithering around me. "You know exactly what I am." A shiver ran down my spine. No, I don't," I said, shaking my head. I could feel my legs weakening beneath me. My body screamed for me to run, to get out of there, but I was rooted to the spot. The figure's presence was magnetic, pulling me in, suffocating any resistance I had left. "You've heard the whispers," it continued, its lips curling into a twisted imitation of a smile. "The scratching, the calls, the voice, my voice." The figure's hands twitched at its sides, as though anticipating something. "You are part of it now, just like all of them." I stepped back, but the floor beneath me seemed to warp, to pull me closer to it. The walls groaned, and I could feel the apartment shifting, growing smaller, as if the very space I was standing in was alive, aware of my every movement. "No," I whispered, more to myself than to the figure. "I'm not one of them. I'm not whatever you are." The figure laughed, low, hollow, and cold. "You think you're different?" It stepped closer, its hand reaching out toward me. "You've been here too long. You've heard it all. You felt the building calling. You've chosen it." "No, I haven't," I said, my voice shaking. But the truth of its words sank deep into me. It wasn't just a fever, the illness. It was something more. The apartment had changed, hadn't it? The atmosphere, the air. Hadn't it felt different? The whispers, the presence, the scratches. It had all been leading me here. The figure was inches from me now. It raised its hand slowly, and I felt the temperature in the room drop drastically. "You are a part of it now," it said softly, "and there's no going back. You're one of us. Forever." I backed away, my mind scrambling for a way out, but it was like the walls themselves had grown teeth, the shadows biting at my heels, pulling me back toward the figure. I could feel the chill radiating off it now, creeping through my skin, sinking into my bones. "You're dead," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. The realization hit me, like a punch to the gut. "You're one of them." The figure nodded, its eyes hollow pits of blackness. "I was, and now you will be too." The room seemed to close in around me as the figure took another step forward. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I turned, stumbling toward the door, but it was too late. The door, which had always been an escape, was now a barrier. It was no longer just a door. It was part of the room, part of the curse. I pounded on it with my fists, but it didn't budge. The shadows crawled up the sides of the door, covering it in a blanket of darkness that made it impossible to see through. I looked back at the figure, its face now inches from mine. "You think you can escape?" it asked, its voice dripping with derision. "You're already trapped. The apartment, the building, it owns you now." I turned toward the window, my chest tight with panic. Maybe I could break the glass, climb out, run into the streets, escape. I reached for the curtains, but as my fingers brushed the fabric, I saw it. The same mark from the door. The symbol etched into the wood, carved into the glass. It was everywhere, following me, marking me, reminding me that there was no way out. No, I gasped. No. I stepped back, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to be pressing in on me. The air thicker, heavier. The whispers surrounded me now, not just from the walls, but from every corner, every crack. They were all around me, suffocating me, drowning me in their voices. I turned back toward the figure, my body trembling. "I won't join you," I said, though my voice was barely a whisper. "I won't." The figure smiled again, its face stretching wider. "You already have," it said softly, as if the words were a caress. "It's over, Daniel. You can't fight it. You can't leave." I took a deep breath, my vision swimming as my body became weak with fear. The truth settled over me, like a dark cloud. I wasn't just trapped in this apartment. I was a part of it, part of whatever dark force had claimed it, the people who had lived here before me. The whispers, the scratching, it had all been leading to this moment. I stumbled back, my legs shaking, my mind barely clinging to the edges of reality. There was no escape, no fighting it. The figure raised its hand again, and I felt myself pulled toward it, as though invisible hands were wrapping around me, guiding me toward the inevitable. I tried to scream, but it was too late. The darkness swallowed me whole, and as my body began to go cold, I felt the apartment take me in, claim me as its own. And somewhere, deep in the distance, I heard the whispers again. But this time they weren't just voices. They were mine,